That's just a nice name for a labor battalion, really. As extra duties, I was assigned as a base schools officer and also as a recorder of the aviation cadet examination program. Subsequently, I became the adjutant at Daniel Field and served, for roughly a year as an adjutant. But I didn't want the war to end without my having some overseas service. I had tried several times to get my commanding officer to allow me to be transferred to some unit that was going overseas. But the adjutant is just like the personal secretary of a commanding officer, and unless he just wants to get rid of you, he's not about to turn you loose. But finally, one told me if I was so anxious to go, then God bless you, go ahead. So I was sent to what was called Command and Staff School, which is not the big Command and Staff School in Kansas, but this was one at Warner Robins, Georgia. The purpose of my going there was to be trained to become a member of an air service group. Now, I grew up here in Athens, going to the Athens High School where I was in the ROTC infantry program, then to the University of Georgia where I was in the ROTC cavalry program. And when I got into the Air Corps program, everything was just completely different. Instead of having squads and platoons and companies and battalions, we start off with squads and flights, and I guess the next up might be the group. Anyway, the group was comparable to a regiment. And so I was to be in an air service group, which is, as I say, comparable to a regiment, commanded by an air service group is composed of 9 different, I should call them squadrons, but they were not all Air Force squadrons. But anyway, we had medical, quartermaster, ordnance, air service repair, and air service supply materials, medical. I may have skipped one or two, but anyway, we had all of these units as a part of our group.
And you were stationed where?
I was stationed at this time. I was at Warner Robins, going to a group preparatory to going into one of those groups, and I had to learn a completely new language. From there, I was assigned to the 54th Air Service Group. And the 54th Air Service Group at that time was just a cadre of officers and men stationed at Avon Park, Florida. I went down to Avon Park, Florida, where we trained out in the mud and the monsoon that they have in June in Florida. And we trained with a combat squadron of B-26 airplanes. Following a few months there in that training, which they call Phase 1 training, we graduated to Phase 2 training and went up to Lakeland Army Air Force in Lakeland, Florida, where we began to serve with the units. And at that time we began receiving officers and men into the unit to fill us out to what was known as Table of Organization Strength. Finally, we got to the point where we were ready to go overseas, and we were inspected by more inspectors than you can conceive of. The inspectors simply got in the way of our training, but despite it, we did complete our training, and we interned at Lakeland Army airfield and went up to Norfolk, actually to Patrick Henry, Virginia, where we spent 2 or 3 nights before being shipped overseas. We then were shipped from Hampton Roads by Liberty ship. In fact, there were several different ships, but my unit was on a Liberty ship to Oran, North Africa. There we stayed for about a month. Of course, we didn't know where we were going. There we stayed for about a month, and then by train we were shipped over to Algiers, in Algeria. Oran is in Algeria, and spent 2 or 3 days before being shipped again by a troop ship from Bombay. From Bombay, we went all the way across India by rail. We got almost into Calcutta, and there the train stopped, left us on the sidetrack for a couple of days. We didn't know why, we didn't know where we were going, and so forth. Then we backtracked a little bit up to a rail station called Golundo, which was on one of the distributaries of the Ganges River. We went down to the Brahmaputra River, and then up the Brahmaputra River to a little called Naranganj. There, we got there, I would say about almost midnight, and we picked up a train which took us to our final destination, which was just outside of what is now called Dhaka, which is the capital of Bangladesh. Of course, it was all India at that time. Our base was in the preparation of being prepared for us at a little village called Tezgaon, Tgaon, and there was a second airfield at another station. What was its name? I think of it. Anyway, we were to supply these 2 twin bases. And as I say, our function was to supply them the medical, the quartermaster, the Air Corps, ordnance, and so forth, all of these various functions. We were not a combat unit, and I never had any combat experience. When we arrived at our base at Tezgaon, as I say, we were the supply line. We found a lot of stuff that was labeled for Project 9, and we were told that nobody knew what Project 9 was but General Hap Arnold and the President. Of course, there must have been a few others in on it, but we were not to know anything about it. But a couple of months later, we found what Project 9 was, because at our base there were a number of gliders, and we were shipping stuff over to a combat field called Hailakandi-Larigat. And there Colonel Cochran and the 1st Air Commando Group was stationed, and their function was to fly what were known as the Chindits, which was a British Indian unit, into Burma for deep range penetration behind the Japanese lines, because the Japanese had almost reached Imphal, India. This was General Wingate's division. We sent, I guess as many as 90 men over there to work with them to get them ready and help with that airlift of the Chindits into Burma. And the operation was, I guess it was successful, but it had a lot of losses in it.
Tell me again.
DITS was the name of this group that was led by General Wingate, and they were to be flown in behind the Japanese lines into central Burma.
But where did the name come from?
I have no idea where
That's
it came
all right.
from. No idea.
That's all right.
That may have been a code name for all I know. But anyway, they were to be flown in by glider. So there were at least 2 or maybe 3. I know I think there were 3 airfields they were to be flown into. I said airfields, that's not correct. 3 fields that they were to be flown into. And airplanes from Colonel Cochrane's group, the 1st Air Commandos, were making daily surveys of these airfields, just flying over them as they went here and yonder, but taking pictures to be sure that they were still usable. They were it was just paddy land, it was not an established field. But I'm told that at one of the fields, and whether this was Chowringi, Broadway, or what, I don't know, when they got there with the gliders, and the gliders had been cut away so all they can do is land, they found that logs had been cut during the previous night, and put across that field. So evidently the Japs had some intelligence that we were coming, or they were coming. I was not among them. I was back at my base.
And the base?
I was back at my base at Tozzer.
Thank you.
Just hearing about this after the fact. But they did succeed in landing enough people there to establish a pretty good sized fighting unit behind the Japanese lines. At our base at the same time, there was a 490th bomb squadron equipped with B-25s, and they had 75 millimeter cannon which fired with propeller, something which I would have been very uneasy with had I been a member of the crew. But anyway, the B-25s were making daily bombing raids on the Japanese lines, which were just over the mountains, over the mountain ridge, which was about 7,000 feet high, between us in India and the Burma plateau. They were having, I would say, good success, but the Japanese were still moving forward toward India. And as a matter of fact, they got as close as the city of Imphal, Imphal, which was not far east of us. The British were still in Imphal, and they formed up what they call a box. They were just boxed in, but they stayed. And they were badly in need of reinforcements. So to our base, there was flown a group, the 64th Transport Group of C-47s, all the way from Italy to our base in Tezgon in order to help redeploy troops to defend Imphal and keep the Japs from coming on into India. So we were to serve them and supply them, provide them everything they needed, just as we were to do the others. Then as the war began to move a little further away from us, the 7th bomb group it was, with B-24 bombers moved into our air base. They had a longer range, so they could drop bombs at a greater distance than 90th had been able to do. And as the Japs were pushed further out, our mission seemed to become the mission of flying gasoline to China. So gasoline was shipped by boat into Chittagong, which was about 90 miles south of us on the Bay of Bengal, and from there by pipeline into our base. And there was established at our base a manufacturing plant to manufacture 55-gallon steel drums. Previous to the establishment of that manufacturing plant, we were using some steel drums, 55-gallon drums, for flying gasoline over to China. And the quality of the drums was so poor that when gasoline was placed in the drum, and the drum placed in an airplane, and the airplane takes off from our base, which, although we were 70 miles from the Bay of Bengal, we were just 28 feet above sea level. But as the airplane gained height and the air pressure diminished, these drums would begin to spew gasoline vapor into the cargo bay of the B-24s, and then there would be a whoosh, and the plane and crew were lost. That happened over and over again. But we got this new manufacturing plant over there. A representative from American Can, a Continental Can, was sent over there as technical representatives. They showed the Indians how to operate that plant, and in no time at all we were turning out 2,500 barrels, 55-gallon barrels per day, and we were loading those into 55-gallon drums to be shipped over the hump. Subsequently, as the war got a little bit older, the C-54 airplane was developed, and it was a much larger cargo plane than we had had before. And so on Air Force's Day, which was January the 1st, 1945, there was a contest, pretty much like a Tech Georgia football game. A contest between the air crews at our Kermatola base, that was our twin base, and our base at Tezgon base, to see which one could fly the greatest number of barrels over to China and return in that one day. And everything was set up around that. We had loudspeakers at each one of these landing fields, announcing what the other base was doing, so we'd work a little bit harder. And during that one day, there were transported from each base between 50 and 60 round trips of C-54 aircraft, carrying each one loaded with 15 tons of aviation gasoline. So they really moved gasoline that day. That was right at the end of the war, though. And by that time, the war was almost over. As I tell you, I never had any combat experience. I did want to see a little bit about what it was like. And so I was able, I don't think I ever said that I was the personnel officer and the adjutant of that air group. And I wrote all the orders. Of course, they were orders that were given by the commanding officer, but I was able to get him to allow me to make a number of trips around India. And I went into New Delhi to Air Force headquarters, probably there. As a matter of fact, that's where I was at the time the Chindits were flown into Burma. I went up by aircraft. On the way back, I could not get air travel because everything that would fly was flying the into Burma. So I came back by rail. And interestingly, as I got on the train in New Delhi, there was a man detraining at New Delhi who was one of my best friends, Merritt Pound from Athens.
Really?
And this is Merritt Pound, who is now dead. His son Merritt still lives here now. But anyway, we got to see each other for a minute while he got off and I got on. Another trip, well, I made many trips to Calcutta to Air Force headquarters because that was my function, was to go there and get things done. I got another trip, which was just a lovely trip, to Kashmir. We went up there to establish a rest camp for our boys, and I was one of the committee that went up there to make the arrangements. And if you've never been there, it's a place to go, but go in March or April. Don't go in the real winter months, and don't go in the summer months. We made arrangements for a rest camp up there, and we were quartered in a houseboat on Dal Lake. Dal Lake was a lake that was formed by the melting waters of the Himalaya Mountains, the snows on the Himalaya Mountains. Clear as crystal and cold as ice. Had no sanitary facilities, but it was nice just the same. And it was right interesting the way we got our meals. We had a bearer on this houseboat. The houseboat would accommodate, 4, 5, 6 people. We had just 3 of us. But the bearer stayed on the shore in a little lean-to, and he would come do the cooking out there and then serve us on this houseboat. But every morning there would be boats a little bit like a shikara, like a canoe. They were called shikaras. They'd be paddled by 2 paddlers, and in front of the paddlers was something like a chaise longue. You could sit there with your back and your feet spread out and just let them take you all the way across the lake with these snow-capped mountains looking down at you. It was just gorgeous. But every morning there would be vegetable vendors at our boat trying to sell us vegetables. And interestingly, some of those vegetables were grown in floating gardens. They'd take bamboo and put it on the lake and put some earth in the bamboo and somehow get it meshed up and have enough earth there to get the roots in. And so the vegetables would grow there on these floating gardens. And again, interestingly, occasionally somebody's floating garden was stolen and carted away by some thief during the night. Anyway, while I was there, I got to the Kashmiri gardens. Pale hands I love, that whole song. And that was a lovely spot. And we took a taxi and went as far up the mountain as we could go to a little place called Tangmarg. And there we got some horse boys to rent us some horses so we could go to a little Gulmarg. Gulmarg was snowed in at the time because this was not the tourist season, but have golf courses up there and stuff like that. But from Gulmarg, we could look out at the mountain that was just a little bit below Mount Everest in height. It was called Can't get it. But anyway, just a beautiful sight. Another trip I had the opportunity of making was down to southern India. We had an aircraft factory down at a place called Bangalore.
Sure.
And I flew into Mysore, which was the capital of that particular, I don't know whether they would call it the province, we'd call it the state. But the Maharaja, who was the high officer of that province, had a palace that was beautiful. He had stables with everything from, this is the carriage that the queen rides in, this is the carriage that the Maharina rides in, and the Maharaja rides in. This one's one that's pulled by the elephant, and this one's pulled by the zebra. But they had a lot of unusual forms of transportation for me. Then I went from there up to a place called Udikamond, which was a mountaintop rest area. It's just about 7 degrees above the north of the equator. And yet it was about 8,000 feet, and in August I was wearing wools and long drawers, and I was still cold. But it was a nice trip to make. I don't know much more to say about my experience at the tail end of the war. After, I guess it was before VJ Day. Oh yeah, let me just bring this in. While I was down there at Mysore in southern India, I was taken through a museum, which really was more like a Chamber of Commerce building showing all of their products. And I was taken by a guide, and here they showed us all kinds of ivory products and hand-carved wood products and fabrics and all kinds of things. Gorgeous work. But one of my guides talked as if the war was just about over. And I said to him, "Why do you think it's over? This is early August." And he says, "Well, it's going to be over in a week, I assure you." And I said, "Well, why do you think so?" And no matter how I know, it's going to be over in about another week. And that's the last thing he told me. Well, bless your soul, I went on down to Udikamond, and while I was at Udikamond, the atomic bombs were dropped. And I was just down there 2 or 3 days, I don't know how long. When I got back to Mysore, this fella came in and said, "I told you so, didn't I?" Did he know something, or was he just guessing and he guessed right? Quien sabe. But it's worried me ever since, or at least it's intrigued me ever since. After the war was up, at the tag end of the war, I developed a hardening of the skin on these 2 fingers, and then they became raw to where I couldn't use either index finger because they were just as raw as could be. And if you ever try to do anything without these 2 index fingers, I can't button my shirt or zip my breeches or use a pencil or anything. Anyway, I was treated by the doctor a dermatologist at our 60th General Hospital in Calcutta, but it didn't do any good. Finally, our group surgeon took me to the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine. And Dr. Goldberg was just between classes. He was evidently teaching classes. But he looked at him and says, well, that's not ringworm with the fingernails like our American dermatologist had told me, but he said, I've got to go on to another class. I don't have the time to go on into it further. About that time, the war ended, and I had an opportunity of catching a flight from our base into Rangoon. And I got to see Rangoon and spent I guess 2 nights there. We borrowed a Jeep, another officer and I did, and we were riding around Rangoon looking at the pagodas and various and sundry things. We wanted to get directions to some place that we were trying to go, so there was a civilian standing on a street corner. We stopped to ask him how to get there, and he says, well, I'm going in that direction. If you'll give me a ride, I'll point it out to you. So we picked him up, and bless your soul, he was a doctor. He also said, that's not ringworm with the nails. Let me see. There was one other interesting experience I had. Can't recall it right this minute. After the war was over, I was transferred to an air group up in northern India, one that was scheduled to come overseas, to come home by air. But after I got up there, it developed that they were going to go to China instead of coming home. So I was transferred. By that time I was a hospital patient. I was transferred to the hospital in Calcutta, a general hospital, for shipment home. As I say, the war by that time had ended. And interestingly again, one of the patients who was helping there in interviewing the newcomers to the hospital, new patients, came up to get my case history. And he was a boy who had gone to the University of Georgia and to Harvard Medical School, Kirk Shepard, from Moultrie, Georgia. So old Kirk and I got together afterward, and since I was ambulatory, we were able to leave the hospital and go out and see something of Calcutta. His parents had a fertilizer factory down in Moultrie, Georgia, and he was interested in trying to see if he couldn't buy bags from India, and that way get them for his parents cheaper than getting them through their normal source. So we went to a place where we could, to a factory where they were making these hemp bags, and there was a Scotsman who was the superintendent of the plant. He showed us around, but then he invited us to go to his house for. When we got to his house, we had a little conversation, and he offered Kirk a drink, and Kirk told him he'd be glad to have a drink of scotch. And this says, well, how much water shall I put in it? He says, I just want it straight. Well, I took a little, I don't drink, so I just took a soda of some sort, whatever he had. But I never will forget, as we left his house, Kirk said to me, I wasn't about to drink that soda pop that you drank, and I wasn't about to let my drink get contaminated. I said, I've gotten along this far without a dysentery, and I sure don't want to catch it now. So we just drank it straight the way it was. It was all a very interesting experience. I was in the service for 4 years, and I rose from second lieutenant to lieutenant colonel at the time of my separation. But I never I never did get into any combat. I think I forgot to say that on one of my trips I got over to, this is the one I told you I'd forgotten. On one of my trips I got over into Burma. I was just taking a vacation trying to see what was going on in the war. And I got leave and I caught a ride with our plane that was going over to one of these stations that supplied either the Merrill's Marauders, I think that time. Then we caught another officer and I. We got over to somewhere in Burma, and we were taken out by an American officer of an ACAC battalion to see some of the front. And we went into a place where a lieutenant colonel of the Berkshire battalion, English, was very nice to us, and he took us out to a pagoda, and he said, now here's our forward line right here, and he said, right, see about 200 yards over here, that's where the Japs are. And this boy who was with me, whose name was Ralph Black from Atlanta, said, well, Colonel Irwin, come on around here to the sunny side, I want to take your picture. And Colonel Irwin said, no, that's on the wrong side. That's on the Japanese side. I'm not going to get out there. And old Blackie said, well, come on out. It'll just take a minute. No, I'm going to do it. So it had the picture taken from the shady side. But about that time, a shell burst over on the side of the pagoda that Blackie had tried to entice him into. Then, on that same trip, I was in a Jeep with this boy from the ACAC battalion, and he was trying to show me where the lines were. And we went down a macadam road, and we found a wire crosser with some tin cans on it, but we crossed on over that wire. We saw where a bridge had been blown out, but the bridge was just over a dry waddy. That's what they call these dry runs. So he went around that and got back on the road, and we saw fellows with camouflage in the helmets, Indians and Indian soldiers, and we kept going, and finally we stopped to ask a British officer whom we saw, who we knew could speak our language, where such and such a place is that we were trying to get to. And this British officer told us that we were almost in the Japanese lines. Now, you missed your turn way back yonder. So we turned around and went back.
It's like hair-raising.
Well, it wasn't exactly hair-raising, but it became hazardous, to say the very least, and just because of our own stupidity. Well, as I say, I wanted to see something, what was going on. I didn't want to just fly a desk all the year, and that's what I was doing. But I've got, in this history, I might add that I was the group historical officer, and I was to write a history during my terminal leave. All of my papers from which I was to write the history were shipped to me when I left, but they did not arrive over here for several months afterward. And when I left Athens, I had left not only a wife and my 2 children, but I also left my brand new business, the Athens Lumber Company, which I had just bought a couple of years earlier. I needed to get back to work, and I had gotten back to work, and I was working from sun up to sundown, trying to get back into the swing of things. So when the information that I had shipped to myself finally arrived, just too busy to do anything with it. So in 1976, I had a heart attack, but I had recovered from that, and I was on a trip to a directors meeting of the Architectural Woodwork Institute, of which we were members. I was on a trip with them. We were going out to California, and at this particular point, I was in a hotel in Oregon, and I couldn't get out and play golf like some of the fellows were doing. I decided right then I'd get started on that history that I was supposed to write. So in 1976, it was September 1945, I put a foreword in here, and when I got back home, I got back on it in earnest, and I finally got it written, and it gives statistical information as to what our group did, and it contains my own personal diary. So I finally got my job done, but I was very late in doing it.
However, you completed it. How long did it take you to put that volume together once you did it in 1976? Was that a year's work or more?
Well, I really have no idea, because I didn't retype stuff. We simply Xeroxed.
It worked. That worked just fine.
Well, we just made up 300 copies of it, but it was done that way. Then I had a personal diary which I kept. I told you that I was the adjutant personnel officer, S1 and adjutant of the group, and I was the one that had charge of all of the secret papers anyway. So even though military discipline says you do not keep a diary, I did keep a diary. I wrote in it almost every night, telling what happened today. But I put it in that field safe along with everything else, which might have been secret, top secret, or whatever. So I kept it, and half of this is my personal diary, just incorporated into the book.
Would you show off the title of the book there, sir, Mr. Bondurant? The 54th Air Service Group, 1943 to 5, an historical compilation. Mr. Bondurant, would it be possible for you to read a small section of your diary? Maybe a page or a half a page?
Shall I just turn to one and see what happens?
Yes, just like you.
You'd think I was on a vacation if I read most of this.
No, I believe you. I simply want to get a smattering of your own voice.
On September the 30th, Colonel Wilson and I went out to the Tezgon field this afternoon and were conducted through the C-54, which had been loaded with 100-octane gasoline ready for takeoff to Kunming, China. I said that we were conducted through the plane, and that's the way I feel about it. The ship was really a whopper. The floor of the cargo space is about 9 feet above the ground, so a rather high ladder is necessary to mount the plane. This cargo space then is about 8 feet wide and 40+ feet long. Forward is a compartment with 2 bunks, then another compartment with a lavatory and so forth. And forward of this is a cockpit where the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and flight engineer sit. The cockpit is nice, light room with scads of gadgets which I don't know much about. I was interested in the steering mechanism, which permits steering the front, the nose wheel, on takeoff, landing, taxiing, and so forth, as I never saw a plane with this feature before. the plane was ready for its maiden mission of gasoline hauling, so was to go out with a rather light cargo. It had about 3,600 gallons of gasoline in its standard operating tanks and an additional gasoline cargo bay. This totals about 4,400 gallons of gasoline, of which it was hoped to discharge about 2,000 gasoline at the Kunming end of the run. So they had to borrow the gasoline they'd just taken over to refill to come back. That is, borrow part of it. That's what had been so very bad about trying to fly it over when we were flying it over in the B-24s. It took almost as much gasoline to get the plane back as you'd taken over there in the first place. That's an exaggeration, but you didn't get to leave very much.
Well, it's hard to imagine running supply lines into the interior of Asia. Let me ask about your manuscript. Did you retype the diary in 1976 then, or this was also photocopied, Xerox from the original, or?
Well, frankly, the secretary at the Athens Lumber Company did retype my diary.
That's just what I was wondering, that's all.
Yeah, she did retype my diary.
I'm glad she did. Where is the Athens Lumber Company today, sir?
Bulldozed to the ground.
Where was the business?
Where was it? It was on Cleveland Avenue. Do you know where Cleveland Avenue is?
I believe I do.
Now, not the Cleveland's way out in the country, but Seaboard Passenger Station, College Avenue. College Avenue bends to the left and becomes Cleveland Avenue. Mm-hmm. And this was a building that was just to your right after you make that turn. I had 7.5 acres down there. During the war, well, I might add that when I was called into the service, I had just bought the Athens Lumber Company, which had been previously the Moss Manufacturing Company. It was owned by my grandfather, or by my uncles and aunt, and I had just bought it. And I didn't expect that it would survive the war. But my wife, who was a personnel officer at the university, she had graduated from the university, graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and had gotten a master's degree in history, and had gone to work supposedly part-time for $60 a month for Dr. Hendren in Dr. Hendren's office. But this is in the days when professor's salary, I think, was $6,000 or thereabout. And she had gone to work on a part-time job at $60 a month, but because this included personnel, and she was supplying teachers to superintendents all over the state, and they would come to town on weekends, and so she would have to work on weekends to take care of them. But she left her job at the university and went down to the mill to try to keep it going for me till I got back. And my uncle, who was Dr. W.L. Moss, I don't know whether you know who he was or not, but he was the discoverer of blood typing.
I see.
Yeah, he was the discoverer of blood typing, which was taught in British academies. He helped her a great deal. And in fact, I would say he is the one that made it possible for her to just keep going. But during the war, the Athens Lumber Company then had to turn to military supplies because there was nothing else being supplied. And Mary made target materials for the Navy. I don't know exactly how they did that, but they had tow targets for Navy gunners to shoot at. She also made chicken crates. Of course, that being a food item, and I guess that was used for military shipping as well as just civilian personnel. And interestingly, she could not get any nails. Nails couldn't be bought without certain priorities. So one of my friends up in Rome, who was in a competitive business, supplied her with some nails he had, surplus to his needs. And business was hard in those days. And business was hard immediately after the war, too. Immediately after the war, a real good example is that we manufactured windows. Well, windows require glass.
Mr. John Bondurant about the World War II era, and he was just describing for me the immediate business climate of the Athens Lumber Company upon the war's end, and the manufacture of windows and window.
I needed glass. I went over to Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, American Window Glass Company, and one other in Atlanta. And at each place, I tried to place an order for carved glass. They would not even take my order. They said, "I've got a stack of orders this thick. What good would it do for me to take it?" Then as I was turning to leave, this was an American Window Glass Company, the man in the office said, "Can you tell me where we can get some resawn gum lumber? We can't ship glass that we make because we can't make any boxes to ship the glass in. Do you know where I can get any resawn gum lumber?" Well, gum lumber is a lousy building material. In fact, it's not building material at all because it warps so badly. It is tough, though it does not break easily. But while I was away, since we couldn't buy the kind of lumber we wanted, whatever was bought was what they could get, and some of it happened to be gum. Well, the gum lumber that was bought we had no need for, and so it was just stacked and left.
Are we talking about gum trees?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sweet gum trees.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, "Well, I happen to know where you could get carved gum lumber." And he says, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you'll sell me a carved gum lumber, I'll sell you a carved glass." So that's the way I got a carved glass. I needed the wood. There were two places I could get some. This was for windows and doors and other housing needs. One place in northern Florida where they had long leaf lumber, and I wanted some of it to make doors out of. And another place was up in North Carolina where I wanted to get some white pine to make some materials out of, make some windows out of, really. So at each place, I had to agree that if I will take this and make about half of it up into a finished product and send it back to you, then I'll sell you the lumber from which you can make it. Incidentally, ceiling prices had to enter into that. I would sell it to you at ceiling prices if you will make it into windows or doors or whatever and send it back to me at ceiling prices, because they had a retail building material yard. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I got the materials with which to manufacture. And it was hard. It was a hard way to live. We were staying with ceiling prices that were established. Some places didn't. But you couldn't buy lumber that wasn't for sale. I bought lumber one day. This was framing lumber. I bought some air-dried framing lumber. When I got the bill for it, the lumber had just been unloaded. The bill came with the lumber. I got the bill for it, and it was not dry to start off with. It was billed to me as air-dried, but it was just green off of the saw. It was billed to me 1/3 number 2 common, which is a low grade, and 1/3 number 1 common, which is a higher grade, and 1/3 C and better, which is a still higher grade. And each one of those has a ceiling price. But what the lumber was just all log run lumber. And I called the fellow and told him I couldn't take that. It was not what it represented as being. And he said, well, I thought you knew how we do business. He says, of course it's not, but it says I can't sell you lumber for $16 a thousand board feet. I think that was the figure. I don't remember for sure. So he says, I've mixed the grades up, and I've called it what it isn't. But if you can't use it, I'll pick it up and take it somewhere else. So that's what it did.
So he was misrepresenting what it was at the outset, at the beginning of the deal.
He was forced. We bought and sold oak flooring. We didn't manufacture oak flooring. We bought oak flooring from Atlanta Oak Flooring Company previous to the war. Tried to buy carved oak flooring after the war. Well, I'm not going to sell you carved oak flooring because if I sell you carved oak flooring, it's going to have to be at this price, and which is, I think, $124 a thousand board feet. But it says if I sell it by the truckload, I can get more than that. And if you come and get it, I can get still more than that. But anyway, I finally bought it, paid him what I had to pay him for it, and I sold it for just about what I paid for it after hauling it over here. But that was the only way we could get a house built. Things were hard.
How many people did you have working for you at the business?
Oh, from 20 to 40, I don't remember at that specific time.
Was it hard to make the payroll?
Oh, yeah, it was always hard to make a payroll. That's one of the things which irritates me about progressive people. Most of the progressive people I know are people who own salaries. And they know they're going to get a check Friday or the first of the month, whichever way they're paid. But the only way I could get up the payroll was by collecting it and by making something for less than it cost, less than I sold it for. And that's hard to do. Yeah. This should not be on the tape, but...
I can pause it if you prefer.
Okay.
That's this last. I'd like to spend a few more minutes with you. But I usually end these interviews by asking people I've been speaking to of your generation that went through the World War II era, what you would have younger people remember of the era or eras you lived through, the Depression, the war, the post-war era.
Well, as I just said to you off the tape, I'm not living in as good a world as I grew up in. I'm not living in as good a society as I grew up in. To what degree I think it's my fault, I don't exactly know. To what degree I think it's my children's fault, I don't exactly know. But we have got to get back to some fundamental things. Now, just being, quotes, liberal, unquote, isn't good enough, or just trying to contribute more money to taxes so it can be given back to somebody who is poor. That's not good enough. we need to get back to the point where we're doing something ourselves for our people. And I wrote a poem once which was the way I felt at the time, and now I'm getting to where I feel in time different, and it's not good. But the gist of this poem that I wrote, why should I worry about, if somebody called me and needed some help, I would just refer them to the welfare department, for the welfare department to help them. Now the time was when I drove my mother and Mrs. John D. Mill, who was a Baptist preacher's wife and a good friend of ours. On Sunday afternoons, I drove them out into the country somewhere to take some food to some people who needed it. But would I think of doing that today? No, I'd give them a telephone number of the welfare department. Now, it may be, and probably is, that the welfare department is a lot more efficient than doing it the old way was. But it doesn't do any good right in here. I can just refer you to the people that are supposed to help you, and I forget about you. And there's too much of that now. Now, in my youth, there were divorces. There were very, very few of them. In my youth, there were illegitimate births, but there were very, very few of them. And now we have 1/3 or something like that of the births are illegitimate. And when most everybody gets divorced, my wife and I next year, we'll celebrate our 67th anniversary together. That's 67 years. Now, divorce. It just seems that everybody who gets married knowing, well, if I don't like it, we'll switch. And that's not good. Now also, when the bomb was dropped at Pearl Harbor, I knew I had a reserve commission. But I happened to be in Washington for the purpose of making a sale, or trying to. When I went by the Adjutant General's office to find out how I could get in. And when I told them I had a reserve commission, they told me to go home and sit down, and the telegram would be there just any day, whether I asked for it or not. But I wanted to go. When I was in your field, as I say, I was there for a good while. And I would have been ashamed to have lived the war out, not having been one of those who went overseas to do whatever had to be done. And yet at the last part of my service at Daniel Field, we had become a replacement group, which meant that we'd get on order to ship so many men to such a place to be shipped overseas. Well, on one, while I was at the air base, a young lieutenant reported in to me. He'd just been assigned to Daniel Field, and he had to report to the adjutant. No sooner had he done it than he explained to me that his wife had diabetes and they had no family to see about her, and so he wanted me to see to it that he didn't get on a shipping list. Well, I didn't control that, so I sent him in to see the colonel. And the colonel took cognizance of the fact that his wife was ill and this fellow shouldn't be shipped overseas. Shortly thereafter, this boy and his wife were doing everything, eating everything at the officers' club and drinking everything at the officers' mess that anybody else did, and it was quite obvious that she didn't have a bad case of diabetes if she had it at all. In fact, they didn't have any. Well, I wish I knew his name still, but I don't. But I bet my hat that after the war, he was running for political office with a veteran's background. But I followed him a little bit. After it became evident that he didn't have the problems that he said he had, the colonel gave orders that he should be put on the next shipping list to go overseas. So we got orders to send a man to a 13-mile station just outside of Charleston for shipment overseas. And so the colonel said, okay, send him. We wrote the order and sent him. Immediately we started getting telephone calls from congressmen all over the place to get him off of the shipping list. And the colonel said, hell no, he's going. So I thought he had gone. When I got to Warner Robins, to this school, to prepare me to go overseas, there he was in the officers' club. What happened to him afterward, I don't know. He was from Buffalo. He was a lawyer. Those things I know. That's all I know about him, but I wish I could have kept up with him because I'd like to know what happened to him. I know you've had me longer than you want me. And
that's not entirely true. You've got a minute or two
You've got more tape than I want. But again, answering your question about what I would like to leave with the younger generation, certainly patriotism. A patriotism the like of which I don't see a whole lot of. I guess partially that's my fault. My parents taught me when I saw the flag that I was to revere it. I was a Boy Scout. We were taught the same kind of thing. All through school, we were taught the same kind of thing. And also not just flag, but the country. But there's so many people I don't think care much about it. I was taught my country may she always be right, but right or wrong my country. And that doesn't sound like it ought to be right. Maybe it shouldn't, but I still believe it. I still want to change the direction of my country, but I want it to be here for me to change. I don't want to let it go by the board and have to work on somebody else's country instead.
Can you tell me a little bit about the hard times during the Depression in Athens?
I can tell you a lot about it. My home was on Cobb Street. I don't know whether this started in 1929 or 30 or 31, but in that time frame, the Southern Mill, which was a textile mill on the Seaboard Railroad, just across the railroad from Boulevard, had closed down. And every morning while we were eating breakfast, there were people from that mill employees who were out of jobs, who would knock on our front door and would ask for any kind of job that they could be assigned to do, just for eggs or bread to eat. They were not asking for any gift whatever. Can we cut your grass, cut your head, scour the porch, do anything? And Mother kept the family up. I say kept her up. It didn't keep the family up, but helped to keep the family fed by doing that kind of thing. Now, very shortly thereafter, and this is a real sore point to me, shortly thereafter there was a hosiery mill that was going to come to Athens. And they selected a site for that hosiery mill. That site was behind my home. It's the Rogers hosiery mill. It was built back there. Part of the land was bought from my mother. Well, it was built in my neighborhood. It was just 200 yards from my home. There were no other houses around it any closer than mine, ours. But they operated there for a number of years, and then, you know, women's hosiery kind of went out of style, and women began to go bare-legged, and the hosiery mill closed down. And General Time bought it, and then subsequently sold it to a woodworking firm called Trusso. Well, the neighbors didn't like Trusso because they had lumber stacked in the mill yard. It's a nice-looking building. You saw that building if you've been here long. And it was a real nice-looking building. But the neighbors didn't like it. They decided they were going to get rid of it. Well, I built 12 houses around that mill after the mill was built, one of which is my home. Other neighbors built around it. It was at that time the hosiery mill, it's true. But as soon as it became the Trusso, the neighbors who had bought homes or built homes there in the neighborhood of an industrial plant decided they were going to get rid of it. And they did. Old Looney said he was going to get rid of it. She was a member of council from my ward, and she assured these people that she would get rid of it. Well, they made that fellow so miserable that he finally moved the plant somewhere else, and he went broke. Well, now, if those folks, and I tried to tell them this, I tried to give them some of the background of that. We were so glad to have that mill here, provide jobs for 102 people. They were taking these folks that were on the street and putting them to work, and living in an industrial neighborhood isn't all that bad anyway. As I say, it was within 200 yards of my home, so I knew about it all the time. It was it was in my boyhood home was within 200 yards. It was in 300 feet of my house, where I live now, and it was not objectionable to me at all. Now, the neighbors were trying to find something to damn it. One fellow said he found a dead rat on his front porch, and that dead rat just had to have come from the mill. Well, it didn't. It came from the bushes out there in his overgrown field or in my overgrown field, either one. It would have come, I don't know where it came from, but he didn't belong to the mill. And somebody else said there were bad odors from there. Well, I went into the plant, and I sniffed around. I couldn't even smell the bad odors in the plant, much less outside. But Athens, having become a cultural center, seems to think it can get along without any manufacturing plants. But there's got to be manufacturing if there are going to be products. And the simple fact that a man works in a manufacturing plant doesn't damn him. I was manufacturing windows and doors and frames and cabinets and moldings and stuff like that for 50 years. And I don't see that degraded me one bit. I know it provided a payroll here for a lot of people for a long time. Reluctant up.
Can you tell me about giving up your business?
Well, I had grown old. I was just a couple of months less than 80 years old. And I have one son who's a lawyer in Atlanta and one son who had worked for me but was not interested in trying to run the mill, and I have a daughter. Anyway, I had to do something with the mill, and the city was interested in buying it to get control of the North Oconee Greenway. And so I made a price to the city and they bought it. They had planned at the time to put an equipment shed there, but subsequently they did not do it. They simply leveled it, and the last time I looked at it, it had pipes stored on it just out in the open.
What year was that?
Well, it was between 6 and 7 years ago.
I remember a lot of this. I'm living on the Nantahala Street.
Oh, you do?
A few blocks from there right now. Can you tell me a little bit about your college years at the University of Georgia?
Yeah.
You said you were gone.
First, let me say, Nantahala. Immediately after the war, I decided I was going to build some houses, some affordable houses. And so I bought a lot on Nantahala, and I built 2 little brick houses side by each on Nantahala. Do you recognize those houses?
I think I do, yes.
I built those. And then I built one on just the same plan I built on Nacoochee. Do you know where that would be? Just off of Boulevard?
I know the street, and I bet I've driven by the houses in the last
Well, it'd be
day or two.
the corner of Nacoochee and Boulevard. It would be right beside of it. Little 2-bedroom house, minimum accommodations, but affordable. And I thought it would be a good demonstration that it is possible to build some affordable housing. And those houses were in the $6,000 price range.
In what year? Say.
46.
Yes, sir.
Changed a lot since then. Well, now you asked me about my education. I went to Athens High School. There, as I told you, I was in the infantry ROTC. Then to college. During my sophomore year in college, I was studying civil engineering, by the way. That was at the time of we were on a semester system then, March examinations anyway. I got a telephone call saying my father had had a heart attack and dropped dead in Piedmont Hotel in Atlanta while he was on a business trip. At a foundry, Georgia Plow & Foundry Company. So I dropped out of school and went down to operate the Georgia Plow & Foundry Company. Here I was 18 years old, and I was going to be the president of the Georgia Plow & Foundry Company. This was 1926. And I ran it to I ran at it until 1931, but the Big Depression was there and we were broke. And in 1931, I had married in 1928, but in 1931, my wife I graduated from the University in journalism, Phi Beta Kappa, gotten a master's degree in history, and she went to work then at the university, and I went back to school. I graduated in 1933 with a degree in civil engineering. Incidentally, I was a colonel of the cavalry regiment my senior year in ROTC. And I was one of 2 honor graduates of the military. And my wife said that Colonel Colley was congratulating her on my receiving that honor. And she said, well, that's nice, but what does it mean? He says, well, it means if John wants to, he can go into the Army. So Mary told me about that. Well, even though I was a colonel of the cavalry regiment, I was not particularly interested in going in making the Army as a career, but I could think that it wouldn't be too bad to have that for a year, 2 or 3, until things get better, and then get into something that I might like better. My senior year in college, even though I was not a good student in freshman year and sophomore year, my junior and senior year I worked, because by that time I had a wife and a little girl. And my senior year in college I had something like a 94.58 average. I decided that the first thing I'd do would be to apply for a school teacher's job here at Athens High School. So I went to see the superintendent of schools. As I say, my junior and senior years were very good. I was not eligible for Phi Beta Kappa, perhaps wouldn't have made it anyway, but I was Phi Kappa Phi. When I went to see the superintendent of schools, Red Grill, and the first thing he asked me is, how many years of education have you had? Or how many hours of education have you had? Well, I haven't had any hours of education in education school. Well, you'd have to have 6 hours to be eligible to become a teacher. So that's out. I didn't have anything else to go into at the moment. I went down to see Colonel Colley and asked him how I go about applying for a commission. Well, I had my commission applying for the Army, the cavalry. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you told my wife that if I ever wanted to, because I was an honor graduate of the military unit, I could get into service. And he said, well, I meant when vacancies occur. He says, right now we're not taking all of the military from the military schools. Not all West Pointers can get in. So that closed the door there. One of my friends and fraternity brothers was a law graduate, and he had his office in Gainesville, and somehow or other he was connected with CCC, trying to help get it started up.
Which stands for?
Civilian Conservation Corps. So I went up to talk to him, and he told me to make an application that he was sure they would have a place for me as an engineer in a CCC camp. So I made the application, and I was given a job as a civil engineer in a Civilian Conservation Corps camp at Cornelia, Georgia, where I stayed for about a year until we finished that project. Then I was transferred from there up to Georgia, and I started a tower on the top of Brasstown Ball Mountain, and about that time they transferred me out of there down to the Forest Service office in Gainesville, and they were trying to get the Hard Labor Creek recreational area started. So they sent me down there to survey it. So I surveyed all the land at Hard Labor Creek and took options on it at about $3 an acre. Can you imagine it? I wish I'd had $3 to buy an acre. But anyway, then they moved a CCC camp in to develop the Hard Labor Creek recreational area. And I was transferred down to Crawfordville as project manager of the Alexander H. Stevens Memorial Park Extension. And down there, I was working under, I don't know exactly who it was under, working under the Forest Service, under the Park Service, rather, but also with the Rehabilitation Administration, determining how many people we should employ. We were instructed that we should not undertake any projects until we had approval of the project. And to have approval of a project, you've got to have a design, manual, cost, material cost, etc., etc. But this was 1936, and there were people that were starving out on farms. I'd get a telegram telling me to put 300 men on, 300 people. Even as many as put 500 on, for whom we didn't have anything already worked out, but we made arrangements with truck drivers to go to Washington, Georgia, Thompson, Georgia, Warrenton, Greensboro, Union Point, Sparta, and haul them in to Crawfordville to work. And we'd put them out on eroded land and plant little seedlings there, try to get something growing.
Pine seedlings or something else?
Well, any kind.
Any kind of seedling?
Any kind. Just get some vegetation growing. Road banks, we would try to slope them and get them grassed and so forth. And at the same time, we had a staff that had an architect and a landscape architect and a surveyor and me as an engineer and secretary and so forth, grader. And we were to develop a group camp to accommodate 100 people. And I designed a dam to impound about a 25-acre lake, 23 acres maybe. And our architect got to work on drawings for the dining hall, infirmary, staff quarters, and then four camp groupings. Each grouping had a wood lodge with a big chimney fireplace in it. And I don't know whether it was 6 cabins or 8 cabins.
We're talking about Hard Labor Creek or Crawfordville?
Crawfordville.
Crawfordville.
And a little bathhouse. So we were working on those designs. We finally got the designs approved, and we built that camp down there, which would accommodate 100 people plus all the staff members. After all the rains that we had here this past month, and after some dams having burst, I went down on a journey, but also to inspect my dam to see whether it was still there.
During what we refer to as the Great Flood of '94, the wettest month we've ever had.
Well,
how's it doing?
It was all right. It's over-designed, but when you design a dam, if a dam ever bursts, you get damned for it. But when you design a dam, you've got to assume something. You can't know what your rainfall is going to be. You can only assume what it may be. And the size of a spillway on a dam, and that's the critical thing, it's got to get rid of that water as fast as it's coming in. And the speed at which that water is going to get to the spillway depends on how hard the rain is falling, how steep the slopes of the ground are, how large an area is being covered by that rain, and the vegetation on it. So you've got all those you've got the drainage area you can measure. The slopes you can average out and assume, and the foliage you can control, but the rainfall ain't no way. So you have to assume all those things. They have what they call a 50-year flood and a 100-year flood and a 500-year flood. Well, I think we've had, in Athens, we had, I guess, a 100-year flood a month ago, but we also had a 100-year flood, I don't know whether it was 64, exactly when it was, 74. It almost washed the Country Club Dam away. But I tell you, the flood we had last time just came within 6 inches of the top of the dam. So by putting enough money into a project, you can build big enough. Now, at Crawfordville, man hours and money was not exactly a problem. But the people that worked at Crawfordville were very interesting. They all worked. Don't you doubt that they worked. And yet those poor fellows would meet our truck at Washington at a pick or at Crawford at Union Point, Warrington, wherever. They'd meet them at, I guess it was 7 o'clock in the morning, I don't remember. But some of them lived so far from that pickup point that it may have taken them an hour or two to get there. Well, similarly, we let them off at that dispersal point, taking them an hour or two to walk back home.
Every day?
Every day. Well, 5 days a week.
Yeah.
They got $21.12 a month, if my memory is correct.
It's interesting to hear because I usually hear about CCC camps involving people working in a camp, men having gone away from home. And I've heard a lot of stories about that being, a fairly successful program.
It was an extremely successful program.
Was that dam still a part of the CCC at that point?
No.
When you were working in Crawfordville? This was another federal program.
CCC had restored the Alexander H. Stevens home.
Yes.
And they had built a water tower, and they had built a number of picnic shelters and latrines. And they were gone. They'd also built a small dam and a bathhouse. But then they were gone when I went down there. Then we...
This month?
Huh?
This month, or they were gone?
They had gone before I went down there.
Oh, I see.
And we acquired it. No, they had already acquired additional property, and we developed that additional property.
I see.
But that CCC program was an outstanding program. The boys were well fed. They were well looked after. From a military point of view, it taught them how to live together, something that they later would need to know, but that was not the purpose of it. And there were women that came to our camp at Cornelia when I was there in CCC to be sure that we were not drilling and teaching anything related to weaponry. They wanted to be sure we were not a military camp. And we were not.
Were those women pacifists or simply...
I think they were.
Okay.
This is interesting, but doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. But as I told you, I was a colonel of the cavalry unit at the university.
I've got another question about that.
I was invited to one Sunday afternoon to eat at the home of Mrs. Popar Hill, and we were going to meet Congresswoman I'll think of her name in a minute. But she was a pacifist. She was the only one who didn't ever vote to go into the war.
Her name is on the tip of my tongue.
I know her name well, Jeanette Rankin.
Yes.
And she's the only one that voted against it. Anyway, when I went to Ms. Hill's home, I deliberately put my uniform on and went out there in uniform to listen. I know she meant well, but she was just wrong. I don't want war. If there's anything in the world we can do to avoid a war, well, up to a point, we should. I don't think it's a good idea to go into Haiti. I don't know what will happen when we get there, but they've got a bad problem already, and whether we'll make it better or worse, I don't know. Our track record doesn't seem to have been very good so far in improving by meddling in somebody else's business.
question I had a moment ago about your experience in the cavalry is simply, where did you stable? Were you still stabling horses as a
yeah.
cavalryman? And
Yeah.
was that in what I know as the university stables now, or I'd like to hear a little bit about the setup of the cavalry, because it seems that the university has gotten huge.
You know where the Coliseum, where the continuing education building is?
I do.
Well, the cavalry barns were just about there.
I see.
And then we had a polo field, which was where Stegman Hall is. That was also a cavalry drill field, I might add. Cavalry, of course, when World War II came, the horse cavalry was dead. That's the reason I was switched over into the field artillery when I was commissioned. The PMS&T, Professor of Military Science and Tactics, suggested to those of us who were engineers that we let him give us a few courses in field artillery and then commissioned us in field artillery rather than cavalry. But when World War II came, of course, cavalry became the armored cavalry, the mounted cavalry, and so cavalry is just a name. It's no longer like it was in the Civil War.
Well, I'm getting near winding up. I have another favorite question that I'm really looking forward to asking you, but I'd also like to ask you to read another little segment of your diary from that era. The final question, I think it's one of my favorites. Would you also tell me how you met your wife?
Yeah. She was a freshman. She was not a freshman. She was a student at the university. And she and I were both Methodists. I went down to an Epworth League one night, and she sat across the table from me. That's where I met her.
And you were married 67 years ago.
These 67 years come the 17th of September.
That would be 1927, and you have...
1928.
28.
Mm-hmm.
And you have 3 children?
3, uh-huh.
And grandchildren?
Well, now let me count. 7, I believe. Let's see. No. 5, 10, 11. 7, 11. I was trying to find something in here that gives us some statistics. I know that's not exactly what you want, but the gasoline statistics are what I'm looking for.
Anything that piques your interest. I simply like having the opportunity to hear the author's voice.
Well, I don't consider myself an author. I just compiled, put things together.
Well, I'm glad you came back to it in 1976.
Well, I am
There
too.
it is.
I don't find the statistics I was looking for. I've compiled in here one thing that a group of our boys were gotten together and sent on a hunting trip up into the Garrow Hills. We had a close connection with a Baptist missionary up there in the Garrow Hills, and he made arrangements for them to have a hunting trip up in the mountains, 50 miles or so north of our base.
What country would that correspond to now? Burma or...
That is in Bangladesh now.
Thank you.
And I got one of the boys to write up a story of his trip, and it's he wrote interestingly. I thought it was real good. Our near midnight start from the local station was accomplished with no more than the usual delays and last-minute discoveries of minor items left, and shortly after the comical little loco snorted us out of the yard, we had slumped into the most comfortable positions possible in the cramped first-class coaches for tried catching some sleep. Engines and Indian trains are seldom in a hurry, which was ably illustrated by our engineer, who bumped and banged through many a stop and start, effectively preventing all but the most hardy from slumbering, even fitfully. They us to going through flat green country, verdant from recent rains, which enhanced the beauty of the taboo, palm and banana groves and rice paddies. The latter, laid out in checkerboard fashion, appeared to comprise a full 90% of the cultivated land in sight. The distance, a squalor of the clustered thatch-roofed huts was pleasantly camouflaged by the graceful palm and taboo trees. He wrote very well, told of their hunting, and I've forgotten what they called.
So that was your buddy's letter. That was your friend's writing, or was that your writing?
No, that was not my writing. That was just one of the enlisted men in our group.
Mm-hmm.
On the way home, I had never written a poem in my life, and I don't claim to be a poet. But when I got on this little ship to come home and realized I was going to have to be on that thing for 30 days, I tell you, it just closed in on me. And for what reason, I don't know. The ship was named the Greeley, and I started writing a poem. She wasn't pretty, the Greeley, as she lay at the Calcutta dock with the filthy Hooghly, that's the river, floating her and surrounded by a dock of British Indian vessels and small log river boats, but to 3,000 homesick GIs. She's the finest ship that floats. A moment we'll take an introduction to make of, as the captain says, all hands. Leading the role, and most important of all, the Coast Guard crew now stands with chow lines pressing as the troops go missing from bow to stern. Now hear this. If an order you missed, the skipper would surely burn. Then there the gals, those popular sows, 100 altogether, Army Nurse, Red Cross, WAC, OS, they set us thither. The officers are 500 strong, the men 5 times that number. When taps does sound and we're bedded down, there's scarcely room for slumber. And then day by day, I wrote another verse and another verse, and I won't burden you to end with any until I get to New York. It wasn't New York's towers with their spires thrust toward the sky, nor was it the crowded avenues, their traffic rushing by. It wasn't the schools and the churches or the parkways filled with trees, or the thoughtless months of privation and the hope for a new life of ease, but the clouded eyes and husky throats of the men who had just off the foam came welling up with this fervent prayer. Thank you, dear God, I'm home.
Mr. Bondurant, thank you very much for spending so much time and so many wonderful things with us on this table.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Is there anything you'd like to add before I cut us off?
Nothing that I know of.